Before we delve into this story, let's make a silent agreement. If you enjoy dark narratives, mysteries that shouldn't be revealed, and stories that leave a mark even after the end, subscribe to the channel now. That way, you don't walk alone through places like this. And write in the comments, where are you watching from? The Winchester mansion stood atop a secluded hill in rural Massachusetts, surrounded by ancient trees whose gnarled branches seemed to point to the sky like accusing fingers. There was nothing supernatural about its architecture at first glance. A spacious, solid Victorian building marked by decades of poorly planned renovations. Yet no one from the area approached after sunset. The silence around the property was not natural. It was dense, as if the very air avoided passing through the rusty iron gates. Ethan Crowley surveyed the mansion from the back seat of his rented car, its engine off. A washed-up investigative journalist, he had accepted the job not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Stacked debts, a tarnished reputation, and constant rejections from major publishers had pushed him towards stories no one wanted to write or read. The proposal to document the Winchester family's story initially seemed like just another desperate attempt to stay relevant. The Winchester family wasn't famous for public scandals or extravagant fortunes. On the contrary, they were remembered for disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a history of psychiatric hospitalizations spanning 4 generations. The last direct heir, Jonathan Winchester, had been found dead 20 years earlier, officially a victim of suicide. The case was closed quickly, without a detailed autopsy, without a thorough investigation. What remained was the mansion, abandoned, sealed, and ignored by local authorities. Ethan got out of the car and felt the weight of the place even before crossing the gate. The gravel floor creaked under his footsteps, its sound echoing exaggeratedly in the empty space. Every window of the mansion seemed to watch him, reflecting the grey light of the late afternoon. There were no signs of vandalism, which was strange for a property abandoned for so long. The doors remained intact, as if no one had ever dared to enter. On the other side of the story was Margaret Hale, a local historian and the main person responsible for keeping the official narrative about the Winchesters alive. Respected in the community, Margaret was known for her rigid stance and insistence on preserving the documented version of events. For her, the family tragedy was the result of hereditary mental illnesses, aggravated by social isolation and a succession of bad decisions. Nothing more than that. Nothing that deserved speculation. It was Margaret who handed Ethan the keys to the mansion, a gesture that contradicted everything she publicly stood for. The meeting between the two had been brief, almost mechanical. She had avoided prolonged eye contact, limiting herself to practical instructions, off-limits areas, documents that could be consulted, recommended visiting hours. At no point had she mentioned Jonathan Winchester or the night of his death. As Ethan turned the rusty key in the main lock, he noticed something that hadn't been mentioned in any of the files he'd read. The house didn't smell of neglect. There was no excessive mold or the characteristic odor of rotting wood. The air was dry, almost clean. The interior was dark but tidy, furniture covered with sheets, pictures lined up. Clocks stopped at exactly the same time. He cautiously walked through the corridors, recording everything with the camera hanging around his neck. The floor creaked unevenly, betraying his presence. At one point he stopped before a staircase leading to the second floor. The steps were marked by uneven wear, as if someone had climbed and descended them repeatedly in a short period of time. Ethan didn't believe in ghost stories. He never had. But he had also learned over the years that official versions often hid more than they revealed. The Winchester mansion didn't scream madness, it screamed control, excessive organization. Imposed silence. At the end of the main corridor, a door stood out because it was unlocked. Unlike the others, It wasn't covered by sheets, nor marked on the maps Margaret had provided. Pushing it open, Ethan found a well-preserved office, with documents meticulously stacked on the desk. Among them was a black-covered notebook, worn at the edges, bearing the name Jonathan W. handwritten. Before he could touch it, a dry sound echoed through the upper floor. A brief thud, followed by footsteps, real, heavy, unmistakable. Ethan froze. The mansion was not empty. Ethan remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to identify the source of the footsteps. The sound had ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the distant creaking of the wood, adjusting to the evening temperature. He took a deep breath, pushed away the uneasy feeling, and entered the office. The room seemed untouched for decades, but not abandoned. The oak desk was clean, without accumulated dust, and the chair remained slightly pushed aside, as if someone had recently gotten up. The black notebook was heavier than it appeared. The pages, filled with firm and precise handwriting, lacked the erratic tone expected of someone considered mentally unstable. Jonathan Winchester wrote objectively, almost clinically. He noted schedules, routines, non-existent visits. Repeated records of nighttime sounds, subtle changes in the arrangement of furniture, doors found open without apparent explanation. There were no explicit delusions, only insistent observations, too methodical to be ignored. The mansion in turn revealed a peculiar internal logic. Long corridors ended in doors, leading to small rooms with no apparent function. Secondary staircases connected floors redundantly. Each architectural modification seemed to have been made to isolate spaces, not to expand them. Ethan recognized the pattern. Someone trying to control the flow of people, restrict movement, create containment zones. Outside, the world remained oblivious. The nearest town, Ashford, maintained a predictable routine, a place where everyone knew each other and where the Winchester family was only remembered in whispers. In the archives of the local newspaper, Ethan had found old news articles describing domestic accidents, unexplained falls, fires of undetermined origin. No in-depth investigation, no official connection between the events. Yet the surnames repeated themselves with uncomfortably frequent use. Margaret Hale constantly appeared in these records, not as the author of the articles, but as a consulted source. Young at the time of the first deaths, she had dedicated her life to cataloguing the history of the city. Her texts defended the thesis that the extreme isolation of the mansion, coupled with the occasional endogamy of the family, had created an inevitable cycle of psychological collapse. It was an accepted explanation because it was simple and comfortable. Ethan decided to explore the second floor. The rooms were arranged almost identically, beds made, closets empty, personal belongings reduced to a minimum. Framed photographs showed family members always separated, never as a group. No celebratory images, only formal portraits with neutral expressions, eyes too focused on the camera. One of the rooms stood out from the others. It was locked. The key was attached to a discreet nail behind a tapestry. Inside, the space seemed to have been used until recently. Footprints on the floor, cups with dried residue, torn papers in the trash. On the walls, almost imperceptible scratches formed repetitive patterns, as if someone had counted days or nights. There, Ethan understood that Jonathan hadn't been the last Winchester to occupy the mansion. Someone had kept the place active, not to live there, but to watch over it, to ensure that certain things remained as they were. As he descended the stairs, he found Margaret Hale in the main room, examining one of the stopped clocks. She showed no surprise at seeing him. She merely commented, in a neutral tone, that the house often settled down at night, producing noises that confused unsuspecting visitors. Her gaze, however, didn't match the tranquility of her words. There was calculation there, defensiveness, as if every possible question already had a rehearsed answer. Margaret wasn't just a guardian of the Winchester's history, she was a part of it, and the mansion, far from being a relic of the past, functioned as an artificially preserved organism, kept silent by people who knew exactly what needed to remain hidden. Margaret's presence at the mansion completely altered the dynamics of the investigation. Ethan realized this immediately. She wasn't there to officially supervise him, nor did she show any genuine interest in cooperating. Her demeanor was one of restraint. She walked through the rooms like someone who knew every curve in the floor, every door that shouldn't be opened, always one step ahead, always ready to redirect the focus. Ethan began to document everything with even more care. He photographed architectural details, marks on the floor, replaced locks. At one point, he noticed that several interior doors had latches installed on the outside, a detail inconsistent with the version that the residents suffered unpredictable episodes. This was not protection against the outside world, but internal control. Someone had been kept in confinement. The conflict ceased to be merely theoretical when Ethan tried to access the basement. Margaret physically stood in front of the door, for the first time abandoning her academic tone. She said the structure was unstable, that previous visits had caused damage, that there was nothing relevant there. The excess of justifications revealed more than it concealed. Ethan backed away, but registered the reaction. The tension between the two became explicit, albeit contained. That night, Ethan decided to stay at the mansion. He didn't tell Margaret. He settled into one of the second-floor bedrooms, keeping the camera on and the audio recorder running. The silence after midnight was too absolute. No insects, no wind, only the non-existent ticking of the stopped clocks. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the sounds began. Rhythmic footsteps in the lower hallway. Not erratic, not hurried. A pattern. Ethan followed the sound to the top of the stairs, watching the movement through the banister. A dim light appeared in the office, the same door he had found unlocked on the first day. As he went downstairs, he found the environment altered. Jonathan's notebook was open, with pages he hadn't seen before, new recent notes, current dates, entries about observers and external interference. Ethan felt a dry chill run down his spine. Someone was writing there, using the name of a dead man. The next day he confronted Margaret. He showed her the images, the notes, the audio recordings. She didn't deny it. She just dodged the question. She said that certain stories required continuity, that some narratives couldn't be interrupted without consequences. She spoke like someone fulfilling an inherited, not chosen, role. The main conflict emerged with brutal clarity. Ethan wanted to reveal the truth. Margaret needed to preserve it, not out of belief, but out of obligation. The mansion was not merely a symbol of the past, but an active mechanism, sustained by people who believed they were preventing something worse. When Ethan tried to leave the property that afternoon, he found the main gate locked from the inside. The padlock had been replaced. His cell phone had no signal. The dirt road, visible in the distance, seemed farther away than the day before. The investigation was no longer a choice. Now it was a siege. Confined to the mansion, Ethan was forced to adapt his investigation. The lack of signal and the locked gate indicated planning, not improvisation. He began to explore areas he had ignored in the first few days, paying attention to patterns that had previously seemed like mere architectural eccentricities. He discovered narrow service passages, hidden behind wooden panels, connecting strategic points in the house. These were not escape routes, but observation corridors. Small openings allowed him to see other rooms without being seen. One of the subplots was revealed in the old records Ethan found in a false cabinet in the east hallway. They were unofficial medical reports, signed by professionals who never appeared in public records. They dealt with episodes of collective dissociation and behavioral contamination. The documents didn't mention individual mental illnesses, but shared patterns among the Winchester family members. Isolation, according to the reports, was not the cause, but the response. Another layer emerged through a previously marginal secondary character, Thomas Reed, the property's former caretaker. City records listed him as missing for 15 years. However, Ethan found records of recent cash payments, noted in a ledger hidden in the pantry. Someone was keeping Reed, or someone in his place, tied to the mansion. Time pressure began to mount when Ethan realized his recordings were being manipulated. Audio files disappeared, videos surfaced corrupted, with cuts too precise to be mere technical glitches. Someone had access to his equipment while he slept. The surveillance was constant, silent, and efficient. Margaret reappeared only when necessary, always offering plausible explanations, always diverting attention. In one of these interactions, she let slip that the city of Ashford depended economically on the historical preservation of the region. The mansion, although officially closed, sustained subsidies, research, and private donations. Revealing the truth would jeopardize more than reputations. It would dismantle an entire structure of convenience and silence. Meanwhile, Ethan began to notice subtle changes in himself, difficulty distinguishing time zones, a feeling of being watched even in enclosed spaces. These weren't symptoms of panic, but of forced adaptation. The house imposed a rhythm. Those who stayed too long ended up adjusting to it. The most unsettling subplot, however, emerged when Ethan found an unsent letter, addressed to a journalist with his own name, dated 10 years earlier. The author was Jonathan Winchester. The content didn't speak of spirits, but of a social containment system maintained by people outside the family. Jonathan claimed that the mansion functioned as a convergence point for extreme behaviors, and that his death had been planned to close a specific cycle. All these lines converged on the same center. The mansion was not cursed by invisible forces, but by human decisions repeated over time. The complexity lay not in the supernatural, but in the deliberate maintenance of an environment of control, surveillance, and sacrifice, and Ethan's time within that system was running out. The turning point came abruptly, without warning or symbolic preparation. Ethan woke up with the stark feeling that he had wasted time, not hours, but days. His wristwatch showed a different date than the last one he remembered. 3 days had passed. The recorder was off, the camera was out of battery, and the room showed clear signs of continuous use that weren't his. He went downstairs looking for Margaret and found her in the basement, the same space she had insisted on keeping inaccessible. The door was open. Inside, the room was spacious, lit by industrial lamps. There were no signs of structural instability. On the contrary, the space had been adapted for prolonged stays, simple beds, metal tables, numbered cabinets, an improvised observation center. On the panels affixed to the walls, photographs of the Winchester family mingled with images of other unknown people, organized by dates and behavioral patterns. Ethan recognized some faces from the Ashford files, residents who had disappeared over the years. No official investigation had connected them to the mansion. Margaret didn't try to stop her from entering. She just watched, exhausted. There, the revelation imposed itself without the need for a lengthy speech. The mansion functioned as a space of voluntary and forced confinement, maintained by an informal group of historical curators, doctors, and local authorities. People considered unstable were isolated there to avoid public incidents, crimes, or social collapses that the city didn't want or couldn't manage. Jonathan Winchester had discovered too early the role his family played in this system. He had tried to expose the workings of the mansion, document the containment cycles, and reveal the names involved. His death had been staged as suicide to preserve the structure. The mistake, however, was allowing his records to survive. The biggest shock came when Ethan found his own name in one of the recent files. Detailed observations about his routine, emotional reactions, sleep patterns. He hadn't just been an investigator drawn to the case. He'd been selected. His professional background, his financial fragility, his obsession with hidden truths made him an ideal candidate for replacement. The mansion needed continuous narratives. It needed someone willing to believe they were discovering something, while in practice assuming the role of yet another keeper of the silence. Margaret wasn't the lone villain. She was simply the current administrator of an old machine. Ethan understood at that moment that leaving wouldn't depend on strength or public exposure, but on accepting or breaking the cycle that sustained the mansion. The direction of the story had changed. The revelation didn't bring immediate relief. It brought weight. Ethan began to move around the mansion with a different awareness, attentive not only to the spaces, but to the invisible routines that kept them functioning. The basement lights were always turned off at the same time. Meals appeared in the kitchen without him seeing who prepared them. Someone continued to ensure the minimum maintenance of the place. Margaret changed after the confrontation. She no longer avoided certain rooms or rigidly controlled Ethan's movements. She acted like someone who had completed the most difficult stage, transferring knowledge. Her actions indicated preparation for a gradual distancing, not resistance. Instead of watching, she began to observe, assessing how Ethan reacted to the new information. Ethan, for his part, reacted practically. He tested limits. He tried the gate again, this time without haste. He found tools in the outside shed, left there intentionally. Nothing was truly hidden. Everything was offered at the right moment. The system depended on the feeling of choice. The consequences also manifested themselves internally. Ethan realized that his initial indignation was beginning to dissipate. Not out of moral agreement, but out of structural understanding. The city wasn't malevolent, it was convenient. People did disappear, yes, but in small enough numbers not to generate panic. The mansion functioned as a social buffer, absorbing what didn't fit in. Jonathan's records took on new meaning. They were not attempts at denunciation, but at negotiation. He had tried to modify the system from within, to reduce harm, to establish clearer criteria. He had failed. His death was the result of excessive resistance, not madness. Ethan faced the most dangerous effect of all, normalization. He began organizing documents, correcting dates, cross-referencing information out of professional habit. Without realizing it, he was taking on roles he had never consciously accepted. The company rewarded efficiency with stability. Margaret, in one of the few direct conversations, commented that everyone in charge had gone through a similar period. Acceptance didn't come from belief, but from exhaustion. Fighting required constant energy. Maintaining the system only required continuity. The ultimate consequence of that phase was clear. Ethan still wanted to leave, but he was no longer sure if destroying the mansion or exposing his role would result in anything better. The conflict had ceased to be external. Now it was a decision. The change in Ethan wasn't sudden, nor was it accompanied by grand pronouncements. It manifested itself in subtle, almost imperceptible choices. Instead of directly confronting the system, he began to analyze it with the detachment he had always applied to major investigations. He observed flaws, not moral ones, but operational ones. The mansion functioned because no one questioned its efficiency, only its existence. He began to review the criteria used to select people destined for confinement. He discovered glaring inconsistencies. Cases classified as potential instability were, in fact, predictable responses to institutional neglect, domestic violence, or medical abandonment. The mansion did not prevent social collapse, it only delayed its visibility. This realization rekindled something Ethan had thought lost: purpose. Without repeating previously failed escape attempts, he created new routes. He used observation passages to map blind spots, reorganized invisible shifts, and identified who was truly keeping the place active besides Margaret. There weren't many. A small system survives through discretion, not force. Ethan's growth occurred when he stopped reacting and started acting strategically. Instead of deleting records, he duplicated them. Instead of confronting Margaret, he began including her in the analyses, forcing her to acknowledge flaws she herself had ignored for years. Her resistance was gradual, silent and human. The exhaustion that had kept her there had also made her vulnerable to change. Ethan introduced minor changes. People with low-risk profiles were redirected to external institutions. Extreme cases were documented more rigorously, nothing that immediately caught the city's attention, but enough to reduce the constant flow of confinements. The mansion slowly began to lose its central function. Ethan's personal transformation became evident when he stopped seeing himself as a victim or a replacement. He didn't need to destroy the system all at once. He needed to make it obsolete. This required patience, something he had never possessed before. For the first time since arriving, Ethan slept without hearing footsteps. The silence wasn't imposed, but real. The house responded to the change in behavior. Less surveillance, less restraint. Overcoming the challenge wasn't about escaping the mansion, but about refusing the role it demanded. Ethan had grown to understand that courage, in that context, wasn't about immediate exposure. It was about strategic persistence, and the story wasn't over yet. The gradual reduction in activity at the mansion did not go unnoticed. Ethan knew this. Old systems tolerate adjustments, but react when their core function is threatened. The first signs came from outside. An unfamiliar car began parking on the dirt road at dusk. Mail that once arrived without delay began to be intercepted. The city, silently, began to look back towards the hilltop. Margaret received an unannounced visit. Two members of the Ashford Historical Council appeared without warning, walking through the mansion with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. They didn't ask about Ethan. They didn't need to. Their questions were directed at the structure, the records, the stability of the asset. The language made it clear that the mansion was not seen as a moral problem, but as an asset. Ethan quickened his pace. He finalized the reorganization of the files, creating physical copies and distributing them to different locations on the property. If they were discovered, they couldn't all be destroyed at once. He resolved the last remaining subplots. Thomas Reed wasn't missing. He had been dead for years. His name had been kept on the records as a front for ongoing payments that funded the silence of key people in the city. Under pressure, Margaret revealed the system's limitations. The mansion needed a periodic event, a death, a public collapse, something to justify its continued existence to its unseen financiers. Without it, the cycle would break, and someone would be held responsible. Historically, that someone had always been a Winchester. Ethan understood the real risk. The system wouldn't simply allow its extinction. It needed symbolic closure, a controlled ending. The preparation for the climax didn't involve escape or physical confrontation, but narrative. Whoever controlled the final story would decide the fate of the mansion. That night, Ethan left the mansion for the first time without being stopped. The gate was open. The car awaited him with a full tank. A silent invitation to disappear and leave everything as it was. He refused. Upon returning, he found Margaret sitting in the office in front of Jonathan's black notebook. The last pages were blank. They were waiting for something definitive, a final entry that would close the cycle, one way or another. The climax was approaching, not as an explosion, but as an irreversible choice. The climax didn't begin with violence, but with writing. Ethan sat at his desk while Margaret watched silently. Jonathan Winchester's black notebook lay open before him, its final pages awaiting a narrative that would justify everything that had come before. For decades, that object had served as an instrument of continuity. Each person in charge left there the version necessary to keep the mansion alive. Ethan wrote something different. He didn't record an imminent death or a convenient collapse. He recorded the complete exposure of the system, with names, dates, methods, and consequences, not as a public denunciation, but as an internal report impossible to ignore. A document that, if discovered, would make any attempt at erasure more dangerous than the truth. When he finished, he handed the notebook to Margaret. She read it without interruption, her face hardening with each page. For the first time, there was no technical way out. If she continued the cycle, the risk of scandal would become real. If she closed the mansion, she would lose the only structure she had known for decades. The turning point came when Margaret did something unexpected. She added her own signature to the end of the text. In doing so, she transformed the account into a collective confession. The system would not survive this. No single sacrifice could sustain it any longer. At that moment, the city's invisible visitors arrived, not as masked figures, but as administrators. The confrontation was verbal, tense, precise. Ethan didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply presented the notebook. His transformation was there. No longer a journalist seeking immediate revelation, but someone who understood the power of the silent threat. The attempt at coercion failed. Killing Ethan would create exactly the public event they had always avoided. Keeping him there had become untenable. The system, for the first time, faced a variable it could not control. The central conflict was resolved without explosion, without symbolic corpse. The mansion lost its function the moment its history ceased to be manipulable. Ethan left the office knowing that nothing would ever go back to normal. The closure of the Winchester mansion was neither immediate nor dramatic. There were no sirens, headlines, or curious crowds. The system that sustained it dismantled itself in the same way it had been built, silently. Subsidies were suspended. Files quietly disappeared. Visits ceased. The house remained standing, but empty, for the first time in decades. Margaret Hale left Ashford a few weeks later. She didn't announce her departure. She simply handed over the keys to the mansion to a state representative and disappeared from the city's routine. Her contribution to historical preservation was officially recognized, but her last works were never published. The Black Notebook was never mentioned in any public report. Ethan returned to civilian life without the impact he had imagined. No publisher was interested in the complete story. The material was too good, too accurate, too dangerous. Still, something had changed. He no longer sought external validation. He began working as an independent consultant, helping journalists and researchers identify similar structures of silence. Small, local, efficient. The town of Ashford moved on. Some residents returned after long absences. Others were never officially found. The absence of the mansion as an escape valve forced local institutions to deal with problems that were previously simply removed from view. The conclusion did not bring full justice nor total reparation. It brought displacement. The truth was not exposed to the public, but it ceased to be confined. The system lost its physical and symbolic shelter. The Winchester mansion remained a historical ruin, visited occasionally by technicians and unsuspecting onlookers. No ghosts, no rituals, just walls that finally no longer served any hidden purpose. And that, for Ethan, was enough. Years later, the Winchester mansion was officially demolished. No ceremony marked the event. In its place, an empty plot of land was erected, sold for a project that never materialized. Those passing by on the road no longer felt the need to slow down. Ethan received a single sheet of paper in the mail with no return address. On it was a sentence written in Jonathan Winchester's handwriting. "Systems die when people stop believing in them." He didn't reply. He simply filed the paper away, among other documents he never intended to publish. Some stories don't need to be told to fulfill their purpose. Stories like that of the Winchester mansion don't just live on paper. They echo in everyday decisions, in accepted silences, in structures that continue to function because no one is willing to question them to the end. As you finish this narrative, reflect on how many mansions exist around us, places, systems, or habits maintained for convenience, not for justice. If this story provoked discomfort, curiosity, or identification, share those impressions. Discuss, question, read it again with fresh eyes. Sometimes, the real rupture begins when someone refuses to accept that silence is the easiest solution.